So that on this day, all around the world, in 40 some odd countries and 200 and some odd churches, in every single one of those places, communion will be celebrated. So we celebrate together, and every one of those communions will be an open communion. So regardless of where you are on your path to God, you are welcome at God's table without barrier or restrictions. And that's just one of the things that thrills me about MCC. I'm thrilled to be here today when your dear Reverend Carol first called upon me. I said yes immediately. I just couldn't think of a better place to be and to hopefully help bring a few words of the Lord to this place this day. I suspect we have here, and I'm just wildly guessing, we might have a few travelers, people who've been to other places. I'm just suspecting, because this is the villages and all the lore that goes on. I remember a number of years ago on my first trip ever to Europe. You know, I'm a New Englander. I'm a transplanted New Englander. I'm out of the closet now. So I'm a transplanted New Englander. And in New England, there's a couple others here too. In New England, when a house becomes 200 years old, that becomes an historic building. And we put a little plaque on it. We say 1789 or whatever the date might be when it was first built. I remember the opening of my eyes when I went to Europe, went to France for the first time. And the hotel I stayed in was 400 years old. And I said, I think I've got it all wrong. I think I've got a very narrow perspective of what's going on in America when we call a building a historic building when it turns 200. Well, one of the first things I got interested in, and maybe some of you have too, in France, is all of the palaces and the chateaux of the kings of France that have been built over hundreds and hundreds of years. And I started visiting them, and I was fascinated by them. So names like Amboise and Angers, Chaumont-sur-Loire. That's a castle, it's a fairy tale castle that sits high on a hill right above the Loire River. Or Loire Valley was a favorite place of the French kings to build their country homes. And of course, Chambord, with its 400 and something rooms that you can't possibly see all really fabulous in its own way. And I've been wondering, why is it we're fascinated by those kinds of things, whether you go to England or Scotland or Ireland, France, East Germany, Eastern Europe, Italy, all full of these palaces. And I guess part of it is that we love seeing how the 1% lived back then. Way different than the peasants lived, and certainly way different than the way we live today. And I guess part of it's a little curiosity about history. The one thing that tied in all the castles and the palaces together is that they were the centers of the entire life of the kingdom. So they were centers of administration, they were centers of power, they were economic centers of the king, they were the centers of military power, and often they were the centers of religious power too. And castles were not invented in Europe. There have been castles and palaces for thousands upon thousands of years, ways to bring the trappings of riches to the heads of state. We think back 4,000 years to the pyramids of Egypt. Now that wasn't where the pharaohs lived, it was where they went after they died, and they were surrounded by those same riches with which they lived. Turns out that the kings of Israel had palaces too. And I'd like to start this morning by focusing on Solomon's palace. Now, Solomon's riches are legendary. He was a very wealthy man. This was about 1,000 years before Christ. And he built, after he built the first temple, he built his palace on a hillside near it. And his palace was reputed to have a throne room that was 75 feet wide and 150 feet long. And it was built up with huge columns supporting the cedar roof, cedar imported from Lebanon. And these huge columns that were built up to support the roof were also of cedar from Lebanon. And in 1 Kings, we have the story, a little bit of description of what Solomon's throne looked like. And just to fill in a few of the sketchy details, it was apparently this large chair that was made of carved ivory, if you can imagine. And if that wasn't enough, it's overlaid with pure gold. Just absolutely fabulous. And on either side of the throne were two enormous carved lions. Of course, lions always associated with royalty. And the throne sat atop 6 steps. And each step was flanked by 2 smaller carved lions. So when you came into the throne room, by golly, you knew where the king was, just by looking around at the furniture. So imagine one day, and by the way, his palace was also the center of, just like all other palaces, the center of power, center of administration, center of the military, and he kept the kingdom's treasury right in a room in the palace. So it was close enough for him to go and see and touch it every day if he wanted, or to look at it, to account for it, to make sure nothing was being stolen. 100 years later, a man came to the throne named Ahab. And you might not be too familiar with his name, except maybe in other contexts. But Ahab has been called the most evil king Israel ever had. And you'll probably recognize his wife's name more than you recognize his name. His wife was Queen Jezebel. And Jezebel had a conniving and a brutal reputation, probably more so than Ahab. And since it was only 100 years, less than 100 years between Solomon and Ahab, it's quite likely that Ahab took up the same throne that Solomon had had. I mean, what better throne to sit atop than the throne of Solomon, right? So, picture one day in the palace, in the throne room, Ahab and Jezebel sitting high above the rest of the commoners on the throne. And through the colonnades from the side comes a dirty man, long hair, long burlap robe, dirty feet, sandals dusty from miles of travel. And he makes his way toward the throne slowly, column by column, not seeming to want to be right out in public from the very beginning. So he's going column by column. Finally, he makes his way right in front of the throne. And he looks up at Ahab and Jezebel and calls out in a loud voice to get their attention. You know, there were a lot of people milling around. This wasn't an empty room. There were government officials doing whatever government officials do. There were favor seekers who were undoubtedly fawning obsequiously over the king and queen, hoping for a mere pittance. There would have been military people there in uniform, which both protected the king and, of course, added to the king's aura of power. So there would have been lots of people milling around, having their little private conversations, and there would be people who would be there to address the king and seek some favor or some relief. So here comes this man making his way proclaiming loudly in front of the throne